Hi everyone, my name is Will Valida. I'm a software engineer and cloud architect, and in this video, we'll be taking an introduction to Azure Deployment Environments. So Azure Deployment Environments essentially help development teams to quickly and easily spin up infrastructure using project-based templates that help us to establish consistency, best practices, and security. Azure deployment environments give us an on-demand access to secure environments which accelerate the different stages of the software development lifecycle in a compliant and cost-efficient way. A deployment environment is a collection of Azure infrastructure resources defined in templates called environment definitions. Developers can deploy infrastructure defined in templates in subscriptions where they have access and then build their applications on top of that infrastructure. Platform engineers can create and manage environment definitions. And to specify which environment definitions are available to developers, platform engineers can associate environment definitions with projects and then assign permissions to developers who need access to those projects. They can also apply Azure governance based on the type of environment, such as your sandbox environments, your testing environments, or your production environments. So the following diagram essentially shows an overview of Azure Deployment Environments capabilities. Your platform engineers will define infrastructure templates and configure subscriptions, identities, permissions, things like that. And your developers will create environments based off those templates and build and deploy applications on the infrastructure that's been provisioned. Environments can support different scenarios. So you can have on-demand environments for sandbox environments for testing, and you could also use CI/CD pipelines for continuous integration and continuous deployment. So let's think about when we would actually use this. So imagine if you're a platform engineer, you can have a couple of scenarios available to you. So Azure Deployment Environments actually helps platform developers apply the right set of policies and settings on various types of environments. You can control the resource configuration that your developers can create, and you can also track environments across projects. You can provide project-based curated set of templates for your infrastructure as code. You can define specific Azure deployment configurations per project and per environment type. You can provide a self-service experience without actually handing over control over subscriptions to your developers. And you can also track costs and ensure compliance with your enterprise policies that you want to apply. Now, for your developers can create environments whenever they need them and then develop the applications on top of the infrastructure. So they can use Azure deployment environments to deploy pre-configured environments for any stage of the development lifecycle. They can spin up a sandbox environment to explore Azure, and they can also create and manage environments through the developer portal with the Azure CLI or the Azure Developer CLI. Now, Azure Deployment Environments provides the following benefits to creating, configuring, and managing environments in the cloud. So the first benefit you get is really standardization and collaboration. This essentially allows you to capture and share infrastructure as code templates in source control within your team or organization. And this helps to easily create on-demand environments, and it helps promoting that collaboration through inner sourcing of templates from your source control repositories. You also get the benefit of compliance and governance. So platform engineering teams can actually build out your environment definitions to enforce enterprise security policies and map projects to subscriptions, identities, and permissions, depending on the environment type. You also have project-based configurations, so you can organize your environment definitions by the type of applications that your developers are working on, rather than having kind of like an unorganized list of templates or traditional infrastructure as code setup that kind of sits in a repository somewhere and no one really looks after it. You also get worry-free self-service capabilities, so your development teams with Azure deployment environments are enabled to quickly and easily create the app infrastructure that they need by using a set of pre-configured templates. So rather than as a developer thinking, okay, how am I going to provision a cache? How am I going to provision a database? I've got to build that up in scratch using Bicep and Terraform. Azure deployment environments kind of sets that up for you already. And you could also track these costs as well to stay within your budget as well. So thanks to providing those templates to your developers, they don't have to worry about setting up monitoring or any cost alerting or anything like that, because as platform engineers, you've kind of provided that for them. And then finally, integration with your existing toolchain. So you can use APIs to provision environments directly from your preferred CI tool, integrated development environment, or any automated release pipeline. And you can also use command line tools to manage and provision your environments. So let's go into a demo. First thing what we'll do is we'll take a tour through how we can actually set up Azure deployment environments using Bicep. And this includes creating resources such as Dev Center, environment types, projects, etc. And then I'll show you how you can actually give access to your developers to the environments that they'll be using, and then also adding a catalog from GitHub which stores your template that you share with your developers. And then finally, I'll show you how you can consume those templates from your Dev Center to provision infrastructure in Azure. Okay, so here I am in Visual Studio Code, and essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through a bit of a tour of all the resources in Bicep that you need to actually go ahead and create a Azure deployment environment. So the first thing that we're going to do is show you what the Dev Center is, because you need to create a Dev Center and attach something called a catalog to that Dev Center. Now, what the catalog is, it essentially contains the application templates, otherwise known as environment definitions, that your developer teams can use to create environments. So in this Bicep file here, devcenter.bicep, here creating a Dev Center is fairly straightforward. So here I've given my Dev Center a name, a location, some tags, and I've also assigned a system assigned identity to it, or a system assigned managed identity. Now, to allow the creation of environments, your Dev Center requires permissions on your subscription. So essentially what you do is you attach an identity to your Dev Center and then assign the necessary permissions to that identity. Now, in this example, I'm using a system assigned managed identity, but if you're using a user assigned managed identity or you prefer to do that, you can actually do that as well. So once you've assigned a system assigned identity or any managed identity to your Dev Center, you can then assign the roles for that Dev Center. So what I've done here, I've got a owner role that I'm defining as a variable up here. This is all available on my GitHub. So if you miss anything, please check the link in the description below, and you'll see where the GitHub code is. So you can actually take a look at this in your own time. So I've defined that role, and then what I've got here is I've got a module for a subscription access. So essentially this is just a basic role assignment. So I've got a principal ID, a role definition ID, and also a principal type. And if I go back into my devcenter.bicep file, here I'm granting my subscription that owner, granting my Dev Center, the owner permission over my subscription. Now, you don't have to give it an owner role explicitly. You can give it contributor access, you can give it user access administration, stuff like that. Please bear in mind, like least privileges. This is just a demo. Owner is, kind of giving it the keys to the kingdom, but use least privileges for your scenarios where you need to. Now, the next thing we need to think about is creating an environment type. Now, we use environment types in Azure Deployment Environments to help us define the different types of environments your development teams can deploy to. And essentially, the power behind this is you can apply different settings for each environment type. So if I go into this devcenter environment type.bicep file, again, really straightforward resource, again, lives into this devcenters environment types resource type, and I'm giving it a name, applying some tags, and then assigning it to a particular Dev Center. So if I go back into my devcenter.bicep file, here I've got this Dev Center environment type. So what I'm doing is I'm using a for loop. I've got numerous environments that I've defined in a config file, and I'm looping over those environment types. So that's going to go ahead and create an environment for each one of those environments. Now, an environment type that you add to your Dev Center is essentially available to each project in the Dev Center, but your environment types aren't enabled by default. When you enable environment type at the project level, the environment type will determine the managed identity and subscription that are used to deploy the environments. So that's something just to keep in mind. So then the next thing we need to do is create a project. Now, in Azure deployment environments, a project will represent a team or a business function within your organization. So you might have a project for, if you're building like e-commerce applications, you might have a project for them. Or if you have like particular domains, you have a data domain, a digital domain, whatever, you might have a project that represents them. And each project might have a development, staging, and production environment. And you can have different configurations for different environments. Now, when you associate a project with a Dev Center, all the settings for the Dev Center are essentially applied to the project. and each project can only be associated with one dev center. So if I go into my project.bicep file, here again, it's really straightforward resource. So I'm giving it a name, location, applying some tags, and then the properties. All your projects will have to belong, will belong to a particular dev center. So here I'm using the dev center ID. Cool. So now what I want to do is create a project environment type. Now in Azure Deployment Environments, project environment types are a subset of the environment types that you configure for your dev center, and they help you pre-configure the types of environments that your specific development teams can go ahead and create. So if I look at this project environment type.bicep file, just click on that. Again, really straightforward. So again, giving it the name, location, assigning it to the project. So the project is the parent type there. And I've also got this role map that I'm creating here. So essentially, before developers can go ahead and create environments based on the environment types in a project, you have to provide them access through role assignments at the level of the project. So if I look at my project file again, here is where I'm doing it. So I've got this project access.bicep file. Again, it's just role assignments that I'm assigning, but I've also got a role map here. So there's two types of roles. So I've got a deployment environments user and also a dev center project admin role. So if I go back into my project.bicep file, I will have like a config file which specifies members. So that's actually a type that I've declared somewhere. Oh no, I'm actually passing it through. And then for each member in that members that I'm passing through to this file, essentially there'll be the principal ID and also the role as well. So that role could either be deployment environment user or a dev center project admin, which is how we assign access to that particular environment types within a project. Cool. So now what we want to look at is catalogs. Essentially, what catalogs are, they help you provide a curated set of infrastructure as code templates, otherwise known as environment definitions, to your deployment team, your development team, sorry, so they can go ahead and create environments. Now, you can attach your own source control repository from either GitHub or Azure DevOps as a catalog, and then specify the folder where your environment definitions live. So to create the catalog itself, I've got this github.catalog.bicep file. And this is a fairly straightforward resource. So again, I'm giving my catalog a name and also assigning it to my dev center. Now you can set up your catalogs for GitHub or Azure DevOps. Here I'm using GitHub. So I'm specifying the branch, the path. This is where all my environment definitions live. The URI, so the actual repository that's hosted on GitHub, and also a secret identifier. So in order to authenticate or add a catalog from either Azure repos or GitHub, you can use for Azure repos a managed service identity or a PAT token. And for GitHub, you can use the Dev Center application within GitHub, or you can use a PAT token as well. Now, for automation purposes, I've had a bit of problems using the Dev Center app. So here I'm just using a PAT token for simplicity. But when you're using PAT tokens, please bear in mind that they expire. You'll have to do some management around refreshing the secret, refreshing the token, making sure this authentication still works. So in order to kind of store that PAT token, I've created a very simple key vault and also a secret as well. Bear in mind that if you're authenticating a catalog through a PAT token, you're going to have to give your dev center permissions over the key vault to retrieve that secret. So that is something to keep in mind. But there it is. But there it is. So there is the PAT token being added as a secret to my key vault. Now, to look at the actual environment definitions themselves, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop into my GitHub. And essentially, I've got a GitHub repository that contains all my Bicep templates. Now, at the time of recording, there's also support for Terraform and Pulumi. I'm just using Bicep because that's the infrastructure as code language that I've been using recently. So here I've got a very simple Azure Container app defined in a Bicep file. So very basic rudimentary resources. So a log analytics workspace, a container app environment that's sending logs to that log analytics workspace, and then also the container app as well. But another thing that I've got here is an environment.yaml file, and this will provide metadata about the template. So here within this template, I'm essentially giving my template a name, also a bit of a summary as well. This template path is the actual infrastructure as code file that's going to be deployed. So that's that main.bicep file. And then I've got some parameters as well. So I can provide some parameters for my CPU core, memory size, also the container image that I'm using, and then also the location of where I'm going to be deploying my container app. And if I look inside my dev center, if I look at catalogs, I can see that my catalog has been configured. Now, one thing I've noticed while working with this, if I go back into my Bicep file, there are two different types of sync types with catalogs. So essentially how it works is you can register your catalog within your dev center, and essentially you either manually or on a schedule, Dev Center will have a look at the repository, see for any changes, and then refresh the catalog based on the templates inside it. So here I've set it to manual. So every time I'm making an update to it, I would have to manually go ahead and update and sync that catalog when I add new templates. You can also do it event driven as well, where every half hour it looks at your repository and then pulls changes into your catalog. But there was a bit of an issue with the portal. So if I have a look at this, I see that the sync has failed, but nothing's actually failed. So if anything does fail, you can look at this through the portal. You can also use the Azure CLI to list all the errors that have occurred during syncing. When I ran it earlier, there was no errors, so I'm not sure what's going on there. You can also trigger a sync manually through the Azure CLI as well, which is pretty cool. Cool. So now that that catalog is made available inside my dev center, if I go to the developer portal, what I can do is I can go ahead and create a new environment. So what I'm going to do is just click on new environment, and I'm going to write test app 02. And then I'm going to select it for my non-prod environment, and the definition container app, that's the only definition that's available inside my catalog. So that's the one I'm going to create. You can also enable a scheduled deletion as well, so you can add a date and also a time as well for when that environment's going to be deleted. So if you don't want your developer teams to just provision resources, leave them there and forget about them because they're still running in the cloud, so they still incur costs, you can enable a scheduled deletion for your resources as well. I'm going to click next, and then you can provide parameters for your environment definition. So here I'm going to deploy it to Australia East. And then for CPU cores, I'm going to choose 0.5. If I click create, that's going to go ahead and create all the resources defined in this template. Go into my Bicep file here. So rather than me having to manually code this up, make sure it all works, and then deploy it, it's already been made available to me because it's in my catalog. And now all I needed to do was go to the Microsoft developer portal, log into my credentials. I've got access to the dev center, so I can go ahead and deploy this environment definition to my Azure subscription. So I'm going to let that run for a little bit. And once it's finished, we'll come back and we'll see what's been deployed. Cool. And through the power of video editing, I can see that my deployment has been successful, or my environment has been created. So if I go into environment resources, this is going to take me into the Azure portal. And then from here, I should see that all my resources have been created successfully. So if I go back into my Bicep file where my catalog is, I've got my container app environment, my log analytics workspace, also my container app that I've defined. That has all been deployed through a push of a button, which is really, really great because rather than as a developer having to kind of build that up from scratch, making sure it's got logging involved, metrics are being collected correctly, cost controls, tags are applied, all that stuff, that's been done for me using this Azure deployment environment. And this is really powerful because if I have Azure policy in place that only allows me to deploy a certain resource with a particular SKU, or I have to apply tags on it, or I need to put budgets in place, whatever it is, rather than as a developer having to build out those Bicep templates from scratch. A platform engineering team has made that available to me in my catalog, which is then connected to my dev center. So in the developer portal, I can go ahead and create the resources needed to build my applications on top of the infrastructure. That concern has already been taken care for me. So if once I'm done with this environment, you can schedule deletions for this, but you can also come to the developer portal here and go ahead and delete that, which will go ahead and delete the underlying resources in Azure as well. Cool. So thanks for listening. This was a introduction into Azure deployment environments, where we learned how we can actually empower our developer teams to quickly and easily spin up application infrastructure using project-based templates that we store inside catalogs that help us to establish consistency and best practices while making sure our resources that we deploy to our environments are secure, accelerating the stages of software development in a compliant and cost-effective way. If you like this video, please give it a like. If you have any questions about Azure deployment environments, please pop them in the comment section below. Also, I'm storing the code that I showed you during this video on my GitHub. I'll add links to the description of this video, so please check it out. And if you have any questions on that, feel free to ask me. No matter where you are in the world, I hope you're having a great day, and we'll see you all next time.